Lenora Vane set down her crystal champagne flute with the kind of deliberate slowness that only truly cruel people have mastered, the kind that makes everyone in the room hold their breath without knowing why. She looked at Naomi the way you look at a stain on an expensive tablecloth. "You know what your problem is, sweetheart?" Lenora said, her voice smooth as polished marble and just as cold. "You actually believe you belong here." The laughter that followed was soft, polite, worse than screaming. Naomi stood perfectly still. Her hands didn't shake. Her face didn't crack. 3 years of practice had taught her how to disappear inside herself while remaining visible in the room. But something was different tonight, and nobody, not Lenora, not the circling relatives, not even Naomi herself, understood yet how completely this single moment was about to destroy everything they thought they knew. If you were standing in that room, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to something you've felt, something you've lived, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell. Every week I bring you stories that go deep, stories about dignity, about silence, about what happens when the wrong person finally decides they've had enough. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because what happens next changes everything. The night Naomi married Roman Vane, she wore her mother's pearl earrings. Not because they were valuable. They weren't, not by the standards of the world Roman moved through. A modest pair, slightly yellowed at the clasps, the kind you'd find in a velvet box at the back of a dresser drawer in a Baltimore row house. Her mother had worn them to church every Sunday for 30 years. She'd pressed them into Naomi's palm the morning of the wedding and said quietly, "Keep something of yourself, baby. Even in that world, keep something." Naomi had thought she understood what her mother meant. She hadn't. Not really. Not yet. Roman Vane was not the kind of man people described casually. When his name came up in conversation, there was always a pause first, a half-second where people seemed to check their surroundings before continuing. He was 41 when they met, broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, with the particular stillness of a man who had learned long ago that he didn't need to raise his voice to make a room go quiet. He'd built his empire the way certain men do, through a combination of ruthless intelligence, strategic generosity, and a reputation for remembering every single thing anyone ever did to cross him. He had also, against all reasonable expectation, fallen completely in love with a 34-year-old museum archivist from Baltimore who had been hired to catalog a private art collection he'd acquired, and had absolutely no idea who he was when she told him he'd stored one of his Basquiats improperly and it was going to warp if he didn't move it. He moved the painting. Then he asked her to dinner. She said she was busy. He asked again. She came to dinner. 3 months later, Roman Vane, a man who had once made a rival's entire business network evaporate overnight, was sitting in her mother's kitchen in Baltimore eating sweet potato pie and asking permission to propose to her daughter. Naomi's mother had looked at him for a long time over the rim of her reading glasses. Then she'd said, "You better make sure she stays herself. You hear me? Whatever else happens, she stays herself." Roman had said, "Yes, ma'am," and he had meant it. The trouble was, Roman understood that promise in terms of what he would do. He never fully considered what the people around him might do when he wasn't watching. The Vane estate sat on 14 acres outside the city, gated, manicured, and enormous in the way that announces not just wealth, but a specific kind of territorial authority. The main house had 11 bedrooms and a ballroom that Naomi had initially thought was a joke when Roman showed it to her. "Who uses a ballroom?" she'd asked, genuinely puzzled. He'd smiled at her in that quiet way he had. "My mother does." She should have heard the warning in that sentence. She heard it later, much later. Lenora Vane was 67 years old and had been the matriarch of this family since Roman's father died 12 years ago. She was elegant in the way that certain women of her generation and social position are elegant, precise, well-maintained, dressed with an intentionality that communicated clearly that nothing about her appearance was accidental. She had silver hair she wore pinned at the back of her neck, and when she smiled at you, you felt warmth for approximately 4 seconds before something underneath the surface of that smile made you vaguely uneasy without being able to say exactly why. At the wedding, Lenora had embraced Naomi. "Welcome to our family, darling," she'd said. Her perfume was expensive and overwhelming. Naomi had thought, She's going to take some getting used to. But she seems like she means well. God, she had been young in her understanding of certain things. Not young in age. Young in the specific knowledge of how a certain category of woman operates. Women who have spent decades wielding social power so skillfully that their cruelty never looks like cruelty from the outside. It always looks like concern, like standards, like protecting something precious. The first year of their marriage, Naomi had been too busy learning the geography of Roman's world to register what was happening directly in front of her. There were so many names to learn, so many customs, so many rooms in that house. Roman traveled constantly. His businesses demanded it. And Naomi had her own work, the consulting she did remotely, the small quiet hours she protected for herself. She was not a woman who needed constant company. She had never been. But she noticed things. The way the household staff looked at her when Lenora was in the building, not unkindly, but carefully. The way people look at someone standing near an unsteady shelf. The way Roman's sister Claudia would be warm and chatty when Roman was present, and then suddenly unavailable, suddenly occupied, suddenly somewhere else the moment his car left the drive. The way certain conversations stopped when Naomi entered a room and resumed after she left it, and how she could sometimes catch the trailing edge of a sentence, a tone, a particular kind of quiet, that felt like the conversational equivalent of a door being pulled shut. She told herself she was imagining it. She told herself she was sensitive, that she was projecting, that this was a new world with new rules and she simply hadn't learned them all yet. She almost convinced herself. Almost. It was at the family dinner in February, Roman and Naomi's second year of marriage, that the first mask fully slipped. Roman had left the table early to take a call. One of those calls that Roman took in another room with the door closed, always with the same expression of controlled urgency on his face. And Naomi had learned not to ask about them in detail because the answers were always vague in ways that suggested deliberate vagueness rather than genuine uncertainty. She'd been sitting beside Claudia, who was Roman's younger sister by 7 years, 34, beautiful in a sharp-featured way, with their mother's talent for making warmth look convincing when she wanted to. They'd been talking about nothing in particular when Lenora spoke from the head of the table. "Naomi." Her voice had a quality, a precision, that instantly changed the temperature of the room. Naomi looked up. "Would you mind going to the kitchen and asking Maria to bring out the second wine?" Lenora gestured vaguely toward the door with her ring-heavy hand. She responds better when family asks directly. The silence that followed wasn't obvious. It was the kind of silence that only the person it's aimed at fully feels. Everyone else at the table seemed to simply continue existing, reaching for bread, dabbing at mouths, studying their plates. Naomi put down her fork. "Of course," she said. She went to the kitchen. She asked Maria. She came back. Later that night, alone in the bathroom with the door locked while Roman slept, she stood at the sink and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time, trying to decide if what had happened was what she thought it was, or if she was reading malice into an absent-minded request. Maria was the housekeeper. Asking the housekeeper for wine was a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Lenora was the head of this household. She asked everyone to do small tasks. It wasn't necessarily, but Naomi was the only person at that table who had been asked, and nobody had reacted as though anything unusual had happened. She turned off the bathroom light and got into bed next to her husband and lay in the dark thinking about her mother's pearl earrings. The second time she was certain, it was Claudia. Roman's sister had a talent for the kind of cruelty that arrives dressed as a compliment. She had a way of saying, "I love that you're so comfortable in your own skin," while looking at what Naomi was wearing with an expression that communicated precisely the opposite. She had a way of referring to Naomi's work, the archiving, the consulting, as your little projects, always with an affectionate tone that made it impossible to directly object to without sounding defensive and oversensitive. "You're so different from the women Roman usually spent time with," Claudia said once, during a lunch that Roman was not present for. She said it with a smile that was designed to read as a compliment. "Different how?" Naomi asked. She kept her voice even. Claudia waved a hand. "Oh, more real." She reached for her water glass. "Roman's always been attracted to authenticity. I think it's wonderful. Some people in our circle made comments, of course. You know how people talk. But I always defended you." Naomi looked at her across the table. "What kind of comments?" Claudia's expression flickered. Just for a moment, a slight recalibration. Nothing that matters, she said warmly. People are small. I don't pay attention to small people. What she did not say, who had made these comments, or what they were, or whether Claudia herself had contributed to them. What she did communicate, precisely and efficiently, was this. People are talking about you, I'm the one defending you, which means your position here is dependent on my goodwill. Naomi smiled back. She carried that lunch home inside her chest like a stone. She didn't tell Roman because she didn't know how. That was the truest explanation, though it took her months to admit it to herself. It wasn't that she was afraid. It wasn't that she doubted he'd believe her. Roman was not a man who disbelieved his wife on principle. He was attentive in the ways he knew how to be attentive, which was genuinely and with considerable force. If she told him something was wrong, he would respond to that. But she had watched Roman with his mother. She had watched him with Claudia. She had watched the way his face changed in their presence. Not softened, exactly, because Roman Vane didn't soften. More like something in him that was always braced and alert went slightly, almost imperceptibly, at ease. These were the people he had grown up around. These were the people who had existed in his life before the empire, before the money, before everything that came after his father died, and Roman had to become the man the family needed him to be. Whatever complicated thorn thing his relationship with them was, it was also the original thing, the thing that predated everything else. How do you tell someone, the people who are original to you are hurting me? And how do you do it without making them feel as though they have to choose? Or worse, without letting them know how long you've been absorbing it quietly, which would make them feel guilty in ways that might make them resent you for causing that guilt? She couldn't find the words that wouldn't damage something. So she found no words at all. She learned instead to manage it. She learned the architecture of the Vane family's social calendar well enough to know which events Roman would attend and which he'd miss. She learned which rooms to avoid when Lenora was in the house. She learned how to excuse herself from conversations before they reached the point where someone said something she'd have to spend the rest of the night trying to unhear. She managed it the way you manage a chronic pain, not by solving it, but by organizing your life around it so carefully that from the outside it doesn't show. What she didn't fully account for was how much of herself was going into that management, how much quieter she was becoming, how many times she said, "I'm just tired," to Roman's carefully worried face in the mornings, and how, over time, that sentence stopped feeling like a deflection and started feeling uncomfortably close to the truth. Roman noticed. Of course he noticed. He was not a man who missed things. Whatever else could be said about Roman Vane, the quality of his attention was extraordinary. He had survived too many rooms full of people who wanted something from him to ever fully stop paying attention. He noticed that Naomi laughed less than she used to. He noticed that she had stopped making those little offhand observations about people and situations that he'd fallen in love with. The dry, precise, slightly wicked commentary on the world around her that had first made him lean across a dinner table toward her without meaning to. He noticed that when they came home from family events, she went to the bathroom immediately and stayed there longer than was necessary. "Naomi," he said, one quiet Tuesday morning when they were alone in the kitchen, no staff, no calls yet, just coffee and the particular specific intimacy of two people in early morning silence. "What's happening with you?" She looked at him over her mug. Her eyes were clear. She had gotten very good at that, keeping her eyes clear and her face neutral, which was a skill she'd developed well before she married him, and which she sometimes thought was both her greatest asset and a thing she resented having needed to develop. "I'm okay," she said. "You're not okay," he said. Not accusing, certain. "Roman." "I'm not going to push," he said, "but I need you to know I see it. Something is taking from you, and I want to know what it is." She looked at him. At the sharp dark planes of his face, at the particular way he held himself even at 7 in the morning, contained, alert, deliberate. She thought about her mother's kitchen in Baltimore and the look on this man's face when he'd asked permission to love her daughter. She thought about what it would cost him if she spoke. "Work stress," she said. "It'll pass." He looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded, once, and he let it go. Not because he believed her, she knew that, but because he was also a man who understood that you couldn't force someone through a door they hadn't decided to open yet. She watched him look down at his coffee cup and felt, in the center of her sternum, a complicated ache that she had no clean name for. He was right there. He was right there, and she was protecting him from something he would want to know. And she couldn't decide if that was love or cowardice or both. And she had a feeling, slow and growing, like water finding the cracks in stone, that the answer to that question was eventually going to cost her something significant. She just hadn't understood yet what the cost would look like when it arrived. The Tuesday morning with the coffee cups became a kind of marker in Naomi's memory, a before and after that she didn't fully recognize as such until much later, when she was looking back at the sequence of events trying to understand exactly where the slow damage had crossed into something irreversible. The week after that kitchen conversation, Roman left for 9 days. 9 days was not unusual. Roman's absences ran on their own calendar, dictated by things Naomi understood only in the broadest outline. Negotiations, territories, men who needed to see his face in the room before they'd agree to anything. She had made her peace with the absences early in their marriage. She had her own work, her own interior life, her own ability to occupy time without requiring someone else to fill it. She was not a woman who fell apart when left alone. Her mother had raised her specifically not to be that woman. But that particular 9-day stretch was the one where things shifted from uncomfortable to something she didn't yet have a word for. It started 3 days after Roman left, when Lenora arrived at the estate unannounced. Naomi was in the study on the second floor, working through a backlog of correspondence for a private collection she was cataloging remotely, when she heard the front door open and then the particular cadence of Lenora's heels on the marble foyer floor, measured, deliberate, the walk of a woman who had never felt unwelcome anywhere in her life and had no intention of starting now. The estate was Roman's house. Roman's name was on the deed, but Lenora moved through it the way certain mothers move through their children's spaces, with the absolute internal conviction that prior claim supersedes legal technicality. Naomi came to the top of the stairs. Lenora was already in the foyer, coat still on, handing something to the housekeeper, talking in that low, efficient way she had when she was giving instructions. She looked up when she heard Naomi's footstep on the landing. Her expression did something complex, a rapid recalibration from whatever she'd expected to find to what she was actually confronted with. "Naomi," she said. Not warmly, not coldly, the exact temperature of someone who has decided to be civil. "Lenora." Naomi came down 3 steps and stopped. "I didn't know you were coming. Roman asked me to check on a few things. The foundation paperwork needs signatures." She lifted a slim leather folder as evidence. "I didn't think I needed to schedule an appointment in my own son's home." Naomi held the railing. "Of course not." Housekeeper Maria had gone very still near the entrance to the kitchen. She was a small woman in her 50s, 20 years with the Vane family, and she had the practiced stillness of someone who has learned that the best way to survive proximity to power is to become temporarily invisible. Lenora surveyed the foyer as though taking stock. "I'll need the blue sitting room. I have calls after the paperwork. I'll let Maria know." "I'll tell her myself," Lenora said, already moving toward the kitchen. "She understands how I like the room set up." Naomi stood on the staircase and watched her mother-in-law walk through her house, giving instructions to her housekeeper, and felt the familiar sensation, the slow, quiet pressure of something she couldn't name pressing against the inside of her chest. She went back upstairs. She sat down at her desk. She looked at her open laptop and the cataloging spreadsheet on the screen, and she could not, for approximately 4 minutes, remember what any of the column headers meant. Then she made herself breathe, made herself focus, made herself return to the work, because the work was hers, and the work was something nobody could walk into and rearrange without her permission. She stayed in the study until she heard Lenora's heels leave the house 4 hours later. Claudia called the next morning. "Mom mentioned she stopped by," she said. Her voice had that particular quality it always had when she was building toward something. Light, casual, with a warmth that felt slightly performative if you'd been listening to it long enough. She said you seemed tired. "I was working," Naomi said. "Of course." A small pause. "You know she worries about you, about whether you're adjusting okay. The estate is a lot to manage for someone who didn't grow up with a beat." "Well, with all of this," Naomi sat with that sentence for a moment, turned it over, let the full shape of it register. "I manage fine," she said. "I know you do." Claudia's voice lifted, reassuring, slightly too bright. "That's what I told her. I said Naomi is incredibly capable. She's not going to be overwhelmed by a house. A laugh that was designed to sound affectionate. I just think sometimes Mom worries that you don't have enough support, that you're isolated. You don't have girlfriends nearby. You don't have family close. I have Roman. Of course. Of course you do. Another pause, this one longer. But Roman isn't always there, is he? The sentence landed with the precision of something thrown carefully. It wasn't a question. It was a statement made to look like a question, the way Claudia did many things, with enough surface plausibility that any objection sounded like oversensitivity. I'll talk to you later, Claudia, Naomi said. She ended the call. She set the phone face down on the desk. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the surface in front of her, pressing her palms against the cool wood, anchoring herself to the physical fact of the room she was in, which was her room in her house. Then she picked the phone back up and almost called Roman. Almost. She got as far as his contact name on the screen, his face in the small photo. She stared at it, thought about what she would say, thought about him, wherever he was, some hotel room in some city, some meeting that had required 9 days away, and thought about the particular weight of what she'd be dropping into his lap if she told him what his sister had just said and what his mother had done, and all of it, the whole accumulated architecture of small, precise humiliations she'd been storing in the back of her mind like evidence she hadn't yet decided how to use. She put the phone down. She went to make herself coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the grounds of the estate, the manicured trees, the fountain that had been there since before Roman's father died, the gate at the far end of the drive, and thought about her mother's row house in Baltimore, where the kitchen window looked out onto a shared backyard and the Pattersons' garage, and how that view had never once made her feel like a visitor. Roman came back on a Thursday, 2 days earlier than scheduled. He walked through the door at 6 in the evening, looking exhausted in the specific way he always looked after long trips. Not physically diminished, because Roman Vane didn't appear physically diminished, but with something behind his eyes that was more tired than usual. He set his bag down, found Naomi in the kitchen, and pulled her into him without saying anything first. She let herself be held. She felt his chin rest on the top of her head, and for a moment, for exactly one moment, she came very close to telling him everything. "You eat?" he asked. "I was about to. I'll order something." They ate on the couch instead of the dining room, which was one of the things about Roman that had surprised her early on. That for all the formality of the world he moved through, he had a deep private preference for the casual, for bare feet and takeout containers and television he half-watched without caring. There were parts of him that were completely at odds with what his public face required, and she had always considered those parts the most genuinely his. 9 days, she said. "I know." "How was it?" "Complicated." He said it the way he always said that kind of thing. Final, not dismissive, but indicating that the door on that particular topic was not currently open. She had learned to hear the difference between his closed doors and his locked ones. This was a closed door. She didn't push. They watched television. His hand found hers on the couch cushion between them. She kept waiting for herself to speak and kept not speaking, and eventually the window where speaking would have felt natural closed, and they were just two people watching something on a screen in the particular quiet of a long marriage's Tuesday evening, and the moment passed the way moments do. The Vane family anniversary dinner was announced 2 weeks after Roman returned. It was an annual event, had been since before Roman's father died, held at the estate, catered, formal in the way Lenora liked her formal events, which meant precision and display and an implicit competition among attendees to demonstrate that they belonged at this table. It included the inner family, which meant Lenora and Claudia's husband and their children, plus assorted cousins, and the particular category of family friend who had been in orbit long enough to be considered near family, plus Roman's business associates who had crossed into the personal over enough years to warrant the invitation. Naomi had attended every year. She had worn appropriate things and said appropriate things, and endured Lenora's particular brand of pointed graciousness and Claudia's particular brand of armored warmth, and every year she had come home and been quietly grateful when it was over. This year, 2 days before the event, Claudia called again. "About the seating," Claudia said. Naomi waited. "Mom's been thinking about the arrangement. She feels it flows better if you're seated at the secondary table this year, with the associates' partners." A pause engineered to sound like consideration. "It's not a demotion or anything, obviously. It's just, The head table is very tight this year, and it makes more sense logistically. Naomi's response came after a silence that lasted exactly as long as she needed to decide how to keep her voice level. The head table. It's the same room, obviously, just positioning. The table where I've sat at every anniversary dinner for 3 years. Naomi. Claudia's voice shifted into its concerned register. I hope you're not going to make this awkward. Mom's already managing a lot of moving pieces for this event. Roman is going to have enough on his plate with the business associates there. I'd hate for there to be any friction. There it was. Smooth, polished, nestled inside a sentence about logistics. The implication that Naomi expressing any objection would be the act of friction, that her removal from her own place at her own husband's family table was the neutral condition, and any response to it was the disruption. I'll talk to Roman, Naomi said. A fractional pause. I think it would be better if you let this one go, Claudia said. Honestly? I think making an issue of seating arrangements is going to reflect badly on you. You know how people in our circle, I said I'll talk to Roman. She ended the call. For the next 20 minutes, she sat on the edge of the bed in their room and did not move. She looked at her own hands in her lap. She thought about what talking to Roman would mean. The conversation, his reaction, the series of events that would follow. She thought about the look he got when something or someone threatened something he cared about, that particular cold stillness. And she thought about what that look directed at his own mother and sister would do to the family he had held together through things she'd only heard secondhand. Then she thought about sitting at the secondary table while Lenora sat at the head of the main table in Naomi's own house, and something in her chest drew tighter than it had ever been. She called Roman. His phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. She sat for another 5 minutes. Then she stood up, walked to her closet, and started choosing what she would wear to the dinner. She did not move to the secondary table. The night of the anniversary dinner, Roman was pulled into a phone call with an overseas contact 40 minutes before guests arrived and was still on it when the first cars came through the gate. Naomi stood in the foyer and welcomed people. She was good at this. The particular skill of making a room feel inhabited, of making people feel seen when they walked through a door. She'd spent years working in institutions where the social architecture mattered, where the difference between a well-run event and a cold one was the quality of attention at the entrance. Lenora arrived with Claudia and walked past Naomi with a nod that contained in it no warmth and no hostility. A nod that communicated with extraordinary precision that Naomi's presence was something Lenora was choosing to acknowledge rather than being compelled to. She said something to Claudia as they moved toward the ballroom, and Claudia glanced back at Naomi with an expression that was almost, not quite, apologetic. Almost. The dinner proceeded in the way these things proceeded. Food that was excellent, conversation that was complicated, the undercurrent of old grievances and established hierarchies flowing beneath the surface of the event like a river nobody acknowledged. Roman emerged from his phone call 20 minutes into the first course, slightly frayed, took his seat at the head of the table, and became in approximately 4 minutes the calm, gravitational center of the room. It was a thing Naomi had always admired about him and occasionally found frightening, the speed with which he could reconstitute himself as the person the room required. He found her eyes across the table, checked on her. She gave him the small nod that meant she was fine. He nodded back, returned to the conversation on his left. 2 hours later, he was pulled back out. An issue with someone in the overseas deal that needed his attention. He'd be back in 20 minutes, he told Naomi quietly. She nodded and watched him go and felt the specific subtle shift in the room that happened every time Roman left it, the slight expansion of space, as though people had been holding themselves at a particular angle and could now relax. She didn't like that shift. She had learned what it meant. She stayed at the table through the next course, talked to the associate on her left, a man named Jeffrey, who ran legitimate construction interests for Roman and was perfectly pleasant in the uncomplicated way of people who have nothing to prove. Around her, the dinner continued. Lenora held court at her end of the table with the ease of a woman in her natural habitat. Claudia's laugh carried across the room every few minutes, practiced and bright. It was Jeffrey who mentioned the library. Incredible collection in there, he said. Roman's grandfather apparently started it. 18th century maritime history, Naomi said. Roman told me. She had cataloged it herself in the first year of their marriage. had spent a February weekend in that room with white cotton gloves and a laptop, which was one of her favorite memories of this house. She excused herself and walked to the library. She needed 2 minutes of quiet. She needed to not be performing composure at a table for 2 minutes. She went to the shelves and found the section she knew best. The Nantucket whaling records, mid-1800s, leather covers worn smooth, and pulled one out and stood holding it in both hands and let herself just breathe. She heard them before she registered what was happening. Lenore's voice first, then Claudia, then two others, cousins, she thought, a woman named Beatrice who had looked at Naomi at the wedding with an expression Naomi still remembered, and a man she'd always known as Uncle Preston, though he was technically Lenore's cousin and not Roman's uncle at all. They had followed her. No, not followed. They had already been moving in this direction, or Lenore had chosen this moment, or it didn't matter. What mattered was that in the space of 30 seconds, Naomi went from being alone in a quiet library to being surrounded, and the door to the ballroom was behind all four of them, and the sound of the dinner party continued as a distant murmur through the wall, and nobody out there knew this was happening. Lenore spoke first. "I think we've been patient long enough." Naomi set the book carefully back on the shelf. She turned around. She kept her hands still at her sides. "Patient," she said. Her voice was even. "With this arrangement," Lenore said. She didn't gesture. She didn't need to. The arrangement meant Naomi, meant the marriage, meant all of it. Roman has always been impulsive. It's a quality that served him in business. In personal matters, it's caused problems before, and this is the largest problem it's caused. "I'm the problem," Naomi said. "Don't be dramatic," Claudia said from slightly behind and to the left of her mother. "Nobody said you're a problem. You're a person. We have nothing against you personally." "You've had nothing against me personally for 3 years," Naomi said. "That's an interesting way to run a campaign." Silence. Beatrice shifted slightly. Preston looked at something on the wall. Lenore's expression didn't change. "My son built something, a name, a legacy, a position, that takes generations to build properly, and it can be damaged very quickly by the wrong associations. I'm not saying anything about you as an individual. I'm speaking practically." "Wrong associations," Naomi repeated. "Our world has expectations," Lenore said. "I didn't create those expectations. I don't particularly endorse all of them. But they exist, and a woman in my position has to work within them or watch everything she's protected get dismantled. So I'm an association that damages your protection." "You're a woman my son married in 3 months," Lenore said, without consulting his family, without thinking about what it would mean. And then he left her in this house and expected everyone to simply adjust. The word came out with a precision that stripped it of any neutrality. "We have adjusted, Naomi. For 3 years we have shown up and played our roles and made things work. But this cannot continue indefinitely. For Roman's sake. For the sake of everything he's built." Naomi was looking at Lenore's face very carefully. She had spent a lot of time over the past 3 years looking at this face and trying to read the thing behind it, trying to understand what exactly Lenore wanted, what the endgame was, what would satisfy her. And for the first time, standing in this library with the wailing records behind her and the muffled sound of a party through the wall, she thought she finally understood it completely. Lenore didn't want Naomi to fail. Lenore wanted Naomi to leave. And she had been making that happen slowly, deliberately, incrementally, with the patience of a woman who understood that the quickest way to remove something from a person's life is to make them believe the removal is their own idea. "You've been talking to him," Naomi said, "about divorce." Claudia's head moved. A small, involuntary movement she immediately corrected. "We've had conversations about Roman's future," Lenore said carefully. "As a family does. You've been encouraging him to end our marriage. We've expressed concerns. To him, without me present." "He is our family," Lenore said, and the quiet force behind the word family was extraordinary. It communicated everything, all of it, the whole architecture of exclusion laid bare in 2 syllables. "He is our family. You are not. You have never been. You were a choice he made impulsively and a mistake we have been managing ever since." Naomi didn't move. She looked at Roman Vane and felt, for the first time in 3 years, nothing close to the urge to make herself smaller. "I have let you do this," Naomi said. "I beg your pardon?" "I have stood in rooms while you introduced me as Roman's companion. I've gone to the kitchen when you wanted wine. I've sat at whatever table you put me at. I've heard what Claudia says about my background, about my work, about everything I've built for myself. I've let all of it happen because I was afraid of what it would do to Roman if I told him." She paused. "I thought I was protecting something." "You were protecting your position," Claudia said. "No," Naomi said. Her voice stayed even. It cost her something to keep it that way, and she paid that cost, and her voice stayed even. "I was protecting him. Because I know what losing family does to people. And I know how much he's already lost. And I didn't want to be the reason he lost more." She looked at Lenora. "But you weren't doing the same thing, were you? You weren't protecting him. You were protecting what you want his life to look like, which is a different thing entirely." Lenora drew herself up. "I am his mother." "You're trying to end his marriage without his knowledge," Naomi said. "That's not mothering, that's maneuvering." The temperature in the room changed. Beatrice cleared her throat. Preston had moved very subtly toward the door. Lenora's eyes were cold in a new way. Not the practiced coldness of managed disdain, but something rawer. Something that suggested Naomi had said something that had actually landed somewhere important. "You will never be a real Vane," Lenora said. Her voice was quiet. "More dangerous for it. You can stand in this library and say whatever you need to say to feel good about yourself tonight. But at the end of this evening, when Roman has to choose between what's convenient for him personally and what's right for this family, you will discover exactly where you stand." She straightened the cuff of her sleeve, a gesture so practiced it was nearly reflexive. "And I think you already know it. That's what keeps you up at night, isn't it? Not us. The question of what happens when Roman finally has to make that choice." Naomi opened her mouth. "You should have told me." The voice came from behind Lenora, behind all of them, deep, quiet, with the specific quality of a sound that occupies every corner of a room simultaneously. Lenora went still. Claudia went still. Beatrice made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Preston turned toward the door and then stopped because Roman was already through it, already in the room, already standing in the light from the hallway, and his face was the most frightening thing Naomi had ever seen him wear, and she had seen him in difficult moments before. Not because he was enraged, because he was not. He was completely, perfectly, terrifyingly calm. And his eyes were on his mother in a way that made the entire room feel like it had changed its geometry. Naomi looked at Roman, at the set of his jaw, at the stillness of his hands at his sides. She looked at Lenora, whose composure, 3 years of absolute unshakable composure, was, for the first time, showing the hairline fracture of something that might, under enough pressure, the hairline fracture in Lenora Vane's composure did not widen immediately. That was the thing about women like Lenora. They had spent so many decades maintaining the surface that even genuine shock registered as only a slight recalibration, a micro-adjustment behind the eyes, the way a very old wall shows a crack without actually falling. She turned toward Roman's voice slowly, the way a person turns when they need those extra half seconds to decide what face to put on before they complete the motion. She didn't find the right face in time. Roman was already looking at her in a way that made the face irrelevant. He had come through the library door without sound. Later, Naomi would think about how extraordinary that was, a man of his size moving through a doorway without any of them hearing it, though she supposed that a man who had survived the things Roman Vane had survived had probably learned a long time ago how to move through spaces without announcing himself. He stood just inside the threshold. He hadn't come further into the room. He didn't need to. His presence had already occupied all of it. "Roman," Lenora said. One word, measured. He didn't respond to his name. His eyes moved from his mother's face to Claudia's, then to Beatrice, then to Preston, and the quality of that survey, methodical, unhurried, recording, made Preston take one small step backward without appearing to realize he'd done it. Then Roman looked at Naomi, not with pity, not with the particular kind of protective urgency she might have expected from a man who had just walked into a room and found his wife cornered by his family. He looked at her the way he looked at things he was in the process of understanding, with total attention, with the specific quality of someone absorbing information they intend to use. "How long?" he said. Not a question the way most people ask questions. A question that was already prepared to receive an answer it wasn't going to like. Naomi looked at him. "Roman, how long has this been happening?" The room was completely silent. The muffled sound of the party in the ballroom had become something almost surreal. Silverware and laughter 30 feet away, while the actual architecture of this family was being examined under a light nobody had turned on before. 3 years, Naomi said. She watched him absorb that, watched something move through his expression that was not anger and not grief, but was somehow located in the territory between them, a region that had its own particular quality of stillness, the way the air goes specific and heavy before a storm that means it. 3 years, he said again. Roman, what you think you heard? Lenora began. I was outside that door for 4 minutes, Roman said. He still wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Naomi. I heard what you said about the divorce conversations. I heard what you said about associations. I heard all of it. Now he looked at his mother. I don't think I heard anything. I know what I heard. Lenora's chin went up a fraction of an inch. I was protecting this family. From what? Roman said. From a decision you made in 3 months without... From what? He said again. Quieter. More dangerous. Lenora stopped. The quiet stretched. Claudia made a small sound that was almost the beginning of a sentence and then wasn't. Everyone get out of this room, Roman said, except Naomi. Nobody moved for 1 beat. Then Preston moved first, quickly, with the efficiency of a man who has been in enough rooms with Roman Vane to know that the instruction was not going to be repeated. Beatrice followed without looking at anyone. Claudia looked at her mother, and then looked at Roman, and then went to the door. And as she passed Naomi, she kept her eyes forward with the specific deliberateness of someone working hard not to make eye contact. Lenora did not move. Mom, Roman said. This is my house. Still quiet. And I'm asking you to leave this room. We'll talk, but not in front of everyone. A long moment. Lenora looked at Naomi. One look, swift, assessing, and then she walked to the door. She didn't rush. She maintained her pace, her posture, her held-together quality. But the held-togetherness had a different texture now. Like something performing structural integrity, it was no longer certain it had. The door clicked shut. Naomi and Roman were alone in the library for the first time. He crossed the room to her. Not quickly. He covered the distance with the same measured quality he brought to everything. And when he reached her, he put both hands on her face and looked at her for a moment without speaking. The way you look at something you're checking for damage before you say anything about it. You should have told me, he said again. Softer now. The accusation was still in it, but it was the accusation of a man in pain rather than a man passing judgment. I know, she said. Why didn't you? Because I know what your family means to you. She felt his thumbs against her cheekbones. She kept her eyes on his. Because you've already lost your father, and I've watched you hold everything together since then. Your mother, your sister, the businesses, all of it. I didn't want to be the thing that came in and cracked it further. Naomi, he exhaled. Something in him shifted, not collapsing but releasing. The slight unwinding of a tension held so long it had become structural. You are not a disruption to my life. You are my life. She heard it. She believed it. And she also thought, clearly and without drama, that is true, and it has never been enough to stop what's been happening to me in this house. There's more, she said. He looked at her. There's more than what you heard tonight, she told him. She told him about the kitchen errand at the February dinner, about Claudia's phone calls and the particular architecture of her sentences, the way she'd built a framework of Naomi's fragility and social inadequacy over years of an apparently warm conversation. She told him about the seating arrangement for tonight, the secondary table, the associates' partners, the smooth logic of the insult. She told him about Lenora's charity foundation events, where Naomi had been introduced to Lenora's society friends as Roman's companion, with a particular emphasis on companion that efficiently communicated everything Lenora intended it to communicate. She told him about the rumors, that she'd married him for money, that she'd had no intention of real partnership, that her background was too different, that she would never belong. She told him about the loneliness of it, the specific loneliness of being surrounded by people at every family event and understanding, with total clarity, that not a single person in the room was on her side. She told him about the Tuesday morning over coffee when he'd asked what was wrong, and she'd said work stress, and watched the disbelief move through his eyes before he'd chosen to accept her answer. She told him she was sorry about that one specifically. Roman stood very still throughout. He asked two questions during the whole of it, both brief, both aimed at clarifying specific events, and otherwise he listened with that quality of listening he had that was different from most people's, the kind where you could feel the full weight of the attention, where nothing she said was disappearing into a distracted background. When she finished, the room held the silence for a moment. Then Roman said, "The divorce conversations. What about them?" "My mother said she'd had conversations with me about my future, about the marriage." He paused. "I need you to understand what I'm about to tell you." Naomi waited. "She has tried," Roman said, "3 times in the past year." The word divorce was not used. It was framed as concern. Questions about whether I was happy, whether I felt Naomi was adjusting well, whether I had considered... He stopped. I shut it down each time. I thought I was shutting down general maternal anxiety. I didn't understand there was a campaign behind it. Naomi looked at him. "You didn't tell me she was asking those questions." "I didn't think it was significant. I handled it." "You handled it without telling me my mother-in-law was suggesting to my husband that he reconsider our marriage." A pause. Something moved through his expression. "Yes." "So we've both been protecting each other from things that were happening." "Yes," he said again, and this time the word had more weight in it. They looked at each other in the library with the wailing records on the shelves around them, and Naomi thought about the shape of what they'd done, both of them absorbing damage separately, in good faith, with the intention of sparing the other, and both of them succeeding only in allowing the damage to accumulate unchecked. The specific tragedy of two careful people being carefully wrong about the same thing in complementary ways. "I need to go back into that room," Roman said. "I know. And I need you to be with me when I do." She looked at him. At the steadiness of his face, the intention behind it, she had spent 3 years managing this alone. The thought of not managing it alone, of standing next to him while he addressed it, produced in her a sensation she couldn't immediately categorize. Relief and terror in equal portions, so close together they were almost indistinguishable. "Okay," she said. They walked back into the ballroom together. The dinner party had continued in their absence, the way dinner parties continue when the people hosting them step out, with a slightly heightened quality of conversation, a slight increase in volume, the social machinery running on its own momentum. When Roman and Naomi appeared in the entrance of the ballroom, the conversation didn't stop immediately. It slowed, like something winding down, table by table, conversation by conversation, until the room was almost quiet and most faces were turned toward the entrance. Naomi felt every one of those looks. She had felt them for 3 years. But standing next to Roman, with his hand at her back, the looks had a different quality. They were uncertain in a way they'd never been before, recalibrating, trying to read the situation from Roman's face the way everyone in Roman's orbit eventually learned to read situations from Roman's face. What they found there made several people put down their glasses. Lenora was seated at the head of the main table. She had returned to her position with characteristic precision, back straight, expression composed, as though the library had been a minor interruption in the evening's natural flow. Claudia was beside her, her husband on her other side, her face doing something complicated when Roman entered the room. Roman walked to the center of the ballroom. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," he said. The conversational quality of it, the absence of ceremony, the plainness, made it more commanding than a speech would have been. "And I want to take a moment to address something, because there are people in this room who I've trusted and who've used that trust in a way I'm going to correct tonight." The room was fully silent now. Jeffrey, the construction associate, sat very straight. A few business associates exchanged glances with the practiced subtlety of people who understood they were witnessing a private matter they were present for through accident of scheduling. Roman looked at his mother. "My wife," he said, "has been treated in my home, at my family's events, and by members of my family, as though she is less than what she is, which is my wife, which is the most important person in my life, which is someone who has shown, every day of the 3 years since I was fortunate enough to convince her to marry me, more grace and patience and genuine character than most people in this room could manage under half the circumstances." Lenore's face was stone, beautiful, controlled, unmoved stone. "I've been absent," Roman continued. "That's on me. I've been away enough and focused on enough other things that I didn't see what was happening in my own house. And the people who should have told me didn't, because she was trying to protect me." He paused. "I don't deserve that kind of protection. Not if the cost is what it was." Claudia looked at the tablecloth. "So here's what changes," Roman said. "Effective tonight." And then the consequences came out, and they were not delivered with anger. That was the thing that made them land so heavily. The complete absence of heat in his voice as he dismantled, piece by piece, the architecture of privilege his family had built around themselves inside his empire. Claudia's husband, who ran one of Roman's legitimate development companies, in a position that had always been understood as a family arrangement rather than a meritocratic one, would be receiving a formal review of his position. The implication was clear to anyone who knew how Roman operated, which was everyone in the room. 3 cousins who occupied properties Roman owned would be receiving formal notice regarding those arrangements. The estate's charitable foundation, the one Lenora had managed as her personal social empire for 11 years, would be moving to independent oversight, effective at the beginning of the next quarter. He stated these things the way you state facts, without drama, without the raised voice that would have made them feel like an outburst rather than what they were, a permanent reconfiguration. "I want to be very clear," Roman said. "I'm not doing this out of anger. I'm doing this because my family had a choice over the past 3 years. They could have welcomed the woman I love. They chose differently, and choices have weight. That's not a punishment. That's just how this works." Then Lenora spoke. She had been silent through all of it. Naomi had been watching her, the rigid spine, the held jaw, the quality of someone maintaining containment through sheer force of will. When she spoke, her voice was completely steady, and the steadiness of it was the most impressive and most frightening thing Naomi had heard from her yet. Roman. One word, his name, weighted with 30 years of motherhood and authority and the particular claim that biological origin confers. "You are going to regret this." "Maybe," Roman said. "You are making a decision about your family based on what I heard with my own ears," he said. "In my own house. Based on the account of a woman who has been working to isolate you from your family since the day she arrived." The steadiness cracked slightly. Not much, but enough. "You think this is love?" "This is strategy, Roman. I have watched women use men like you my entire life. I watched it happen to your father, and I watched the damage it did, and I swore I would never—" "Don't," Roman said. Quiet. Final. The words sat in the room like a wall. "I am your mother." "I know who you are," Roman said, "and I need you to hear me. Naomi is my wife. She carries my name because I gave it to her, and she has earned more loyalty from me than anyone in this room had to offer her. Whatever you believe you were doing, whatever story you've told yourself about protecting the family, what you were actually doing was making the woman I love feel unwelcome in her own home for 3 years. And I was too blind, or too absent, or too something to see it." He stopped. "That ends tonight." A long silence. Then Lenora said very quietly, "Choose carefully." "I already chose," Roman said. "I chose when I married her." He turned. He found Naomi's eyes. He crossed the room to where she stood and took her hand, and the grip of his hand was the most concrete thing she'd felt in a very long time. They walked toward the door together. The drive home, to the private residence, not the estate, was almost completely quiet. Roman drove. He did that sometimes when something required him to have something to do with his hands, something mechanical and controlled that gave the rest of him space to process. Naomi sat in the passenger seat and watched the lights of the city move past the window and felt, for the first time in recent memory, the particular quality of exhaustion that comes after a very long-held breath. She felt also, beneath the exhaustion, something more complicated, because Roman had done what she had not allowed herself to believe he would do. He had stood in that room, and he had chosen, clearly and publicly, without hesitation, in a way that couldn't be taken back or reinterpreted or managed down later. He had done the thing she had protected him from having to do, and he had done it without crumbling. But now it was done. And the thing about irrevocable acts is that they have consequences that continue after the act itself ends. "Your mother's never going to forgive me for this," Naomi said. Roman was quiet for a moment. "That's her choice to make." Roman. "Naomi, I'm not interested in managing her feelings about a situation she created. She's your mother. I know who she is." He stopped at a light. The red of it lit the interior of the car. And I know what she did. Both things are true at the same time. I can hold both things. Naomi looked at the side of his face in the red light. You knew she'd been asking you about the marriage. I handled it. You handled it and didn't tell me. He looked at her. Yes. Why? A pause. Because I thought I was protecting you from anxiety about something I considered already resolved. And I didn't tell you what was happening because I thought I was protecting you from having to choose. She let that sit between them. We've been doing the same thing in both directions. Yeah, he said. The light changed. He looked back at the road. We have. They drove the rest of the way in silence that was not comfortable exactly, but was honest, which was a different and more valuable thing. What Naomi didn't know, what Roman had not told her in the library, or in the ballroom, or in the car, was what he had found on his phone while he was walking back from the overseas call. What had actually caused him to take the long way back through the house, instead of returning directly to the ballroom. It was a message. From a number he recognized as belonging to Marcus Webb, a man who had been in Roman's orbit for 6 years, a fixer of the particular category of problems that Roman's world generated, a man whose loyalty Roman had considered absolute in the way you consider certain foundations absolute until you discover they aren't. The message was simple. 8 words. She's been talking to Donovan's people. Thought you should know. Roman had read it twice. Then he'd put the phone in his jacket pocket and continued walking. And he'd turned toward the library because he'd heard voices. And then he'd stopped outside the door because of what he heard inside it. And for 4 minutes he'd stood in the hallway and listened to his mother dismantle his marriage, and he'd let it run because he needed to hear all of it. And his mind had been doing 2 things simultaneously. Processing what he was hearing in that room and processing what the message meant. Donovan. Victor Donovan was Roman's primary competitor in the legitimate real estate ventures. More significantly, he was the man who, 2 years ago, had made a very quiet, very serious offer to acquire several of Roman's most profitable enterprises. Roman had declined. The relationship since then had been the particular kind of professional hostility that stays cold and controlled, because both parties understand that the alternative to cold control is an escalation neither can afford. Donovan's people. Roman had been calm in the library. He had been calm in the ballroom. He was still calm in the car. But somewhere beneath the calm, something had shifted on its axis. Because if Naomi had been in contact with Donovan's organization, then what had happened in the library tonight was not the only story. If there was something his wife had not told him, not because she was protecting him, but because there was something to protect from him, he told himself he didn't believe it. He almost convinced himself. He waited until Naomi was asleep. Then he sat in the dark of the study in the private residence with his phone, and he called Marcus Webb. Webb picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake waiting for it. Talk, Roman said. 2 weeks ago, Webb said. A meeting. Coffee place downtown, the one on Meridian. She was there for 40 minutes. The woman she met with is Donovan's VP of Acquisitions. Name is Karen Sells. I've confirmed it 3 different ways. Roman was quiet. I'm sorry, Webb said. I know this isn't what was discussed. I don't have audio. I have the meeting confirmed, and I have the location, and I have the duration. I don't have content. Who else knows about this? Just you. Roman set the phone on the desk without ending the call and sat for a moment in the dark. He looked at his own hands on the desk surface. The house was quiet around him. Somewhere down the hall, Naomi was asleep in their bed. He thought about the library, about what she'd told him, the accumulated years of it, delivered without self-pity, with the particular honesty of someone who had been waiting a long time to say the things they'd been carrying. He thought about how it had landed in him. He thought about his mother's face, and Claudia's face, and the ballroom, and what he'd said in it, things he could not unsay. He thought about Donovan's VP of Acquisitions sitting across a coffee table from his wife for 40 minutes. He picked up the phone. I need the content, he said. Whatever it takes. I need to know what was said in that meeting. Understood, Webb said. And Marcus. Roman paused. Nobody else. You understand me. This stays completely quiet until I know what I'm dealing with. He ended the call. He sat in the dark for a long time. I was still sitting there when the light in the hallway went on, and Naomi appeared in the doorway in her robe, her face soft with sleep, looking at him with the particular expression she had when she woke and found him gone from bed. Concern, confusion, the slight vulnerability of someone caught between sleep and waking. "Roman," she said, "what are you doing?" He looked at her from across the room. He made his face do the thing it knew how to do, the calm, the steadiness, the quality of a man completely in control of his circumstances. He had been making his face do that thing for 20 years, and he was very good at it. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Go back to bed. I'll be there in a few minutes." She looked at him for a moment longer. Something in her expression suggested she was reading something she couldn't quite name, a slight wrongness in the texture of the room, the particular quality of his stillness. But she was tired. It had been an enormous night, and she trusted him. "Don't stay up too late," she said. "I won't." She went back down the hallway. The light went off. Roman sat in the dark with his phone on the desk and the message still open on the screen and the image of Naomi's sleeping face somewhere down the hall. And he thought about what it meant to be a man who had just publicly, irrevocably declared his wife to be the most important person in his life, and who was now sitting in the dark wondering if she had been sitting across a table from his primary enemy and deciding what to. The hairline fracture in Roman Vane's composure did not spread immediately. That was the thing about women like her. They had spent too many decades building the architecture of their self-possession to let it collapse in one moment, even a moment like this one. Even with her son standing in the doorway of the library with that look on his face, even with the silence in the room pressing down on everyone like a physical weight, Lenora did not crumble. She recalibrated. Naomi watched her do it, watched the almost imperceptible squaring of the shoulders, the slight lift of the chin, the rapid internal calculation of someone assessing new variables and determining the best available position. Roman hadn't moved from the doorway. He didn't need to. He had that quality, the ability to fill a space completely without advancing into it. He stood with one hand against the doorframe and his jacket still on from wherever he'd been, and the light from the hallway caught the left side of his face and left the right in shadow, and nobody in that room said a word. Claudia broke first. Not with words, with movement. A small involuntary step backward that she immediately tried to disguise as shifting her weight. It didn't work. Roman's eyes moved to her briefly, registered the movement, moved back to Lenora. "Roman," Lenora said. Her voice was controlled. Impressive, actually, given the circumstances. "How much did you hear?" "Enough," he said. "Then you heard a private family conversation that was taken out of context. I heard you tell my wife she will never be a real Vane." His voice was quiet. It was the quietest voice in the room, and it was the loudest thing anyone had said all evening. "I heard you tell her that I'll choose the family over her. I heard you say you've been having conversations about our marriage." He paused. The pause had weight. "Without her. Without me." Lenora held his gaze. "I have been protecting this family for 30 years. Stop." One word, no volume behind it. The kind of stop that doesn't require volume because the person saying it has never needed volume to be obeyed. Lenora stopped. Naomi was standing very still near the bookshelf. She was watching Roman's face and trying to read what was underneath the calm, because she knew him well enough to know that the calm itself was the thing to pay attention to. Not a sign of composure, but of the specific focused state he entered when he had made a decision and was now simply executing it. She had seen it twice before in their marriage, and both times the aftermath had been significant. She had never been the subject of it. She was not certain how she felt about being it now. "Preston," Roman said without looking at him. "Beatrice, go back to the dinner." Preston left Soakley, the door swung behind him. Beatrice followed without making eye contact with anyone. The door settled back into its frame, and then it was only 4 of them, Roman, Naomi, Lenora, Claudia, and the room felt simultaneously larger and smaller than it had 30 seconds ago. Roman finally moved. He crossed the room to Naomi and stood beside her, and the simple geography of it, his body next to hers, facing the same direction, facing them, communicated something so clearly that Claudia's expression shifted in a way she couldn't fully control. "How long?" Roman said, looking at his mother. Lenora's jaw moved. "Roman, if you would just allow me to—" "How long has this been happening?" Not a question, a demand for accounting. Naomi felt the moment stretch. She felt Roman's arm against hers, the warmth of it, and she felt the question he was asking land somewhere in her own chest because it was also, tangentially, a question for her. How long did you let this go on without telling me? And she braced herself for that. We have had concerns since the beginning, Lenore said. She had found a register, dignified, measured, the register of a woman who believes she is in the right and is prepared to defend it on those terms. I have expressed those concerns appropriately and privately within this family. I will not apologize for that. Concerns, Roman said, about the marriage, about the pace of it, about what it means for— You went to my associates, Roman said. The shift in the room was immediate. Lenore's chin moved. Claudia made a sound. You spoke to Jeffrey Marsh, Roman said, 3 months ago. You told him that the marriage was under review. Naomi turned to look. She hadn't known that. Under review, Roman repeated, like it was a business contract, like it was something you had authority over. His voice was still quiet. The quietness of it was becoming unbearable to be in the presence of. You went to a man who works for me, and you made comments about my marriage to create the impression that I was reconsidering it, so that by the time it reached the ears of anyone who needed to respect my decisions, the ground would already be prepared. Lenore said nothing. That's not concern, Roman said. That's a campaign. Roman, but then, Claudia started. Claudia. He looked at his sister. She closed her mouth. I'll get to you. He looked back at Lenore. And for the first time, something shifted in Lenore's face that wasn't calculation, something that might have been, underneath everything, something close to fear. Not of Roman's anger, because she had navigated Roman's anger before. Fear of something else. Fear of the specific quality of his stillness right now, which communicated that he had already decided something and was beyond the point where anything she said would change it. You told her she would never be a real Vane, Roman said again. I told her the truth about how this world— She is my wife. His voice broke on nothing. It didn't crack, didn't rise. It simply landed with the full force of everything behind it. She carries my name because I gave it to her. She is in this house because I brought her here. She has sat at that table for 3 years and smiled at people who were working against her because she was trying to protect me from knowing. He stopped. A breath. She was protecting me. From my own family. The last 4 words fell into the room and lay there. Claudia had gone pale. Lenore had not, but something in her posture had changed. The absolute uprightness of her spine had modified by degrees almost too small to measure. And on a woman who had held that posture for 40 years, the modification was as significant as collapse would be on anyone else. I want to understand something, Roman said. He turned slightly to look at Naomi, not asking for permission, checking on her. There was a difference, and she felt it. She gave him the smallest nod. He turned back. 3 years. You've had 3 years in which you could have come to me. You could have told me your concerns. You could have had a conversation with me like a person who trusts another person. He let that sit. Why didn't you? Lenore looked at her son. Because you would have defended her. Yes, Roman said. I would have. Without hearing us. I would have listened. Then I would have defended her, because she is my wife and she had done nothing to deserve what you were doing. He shook his head. One small movement. You know what's interesting? You've spent 3 years telling Naomi she doesn't belong here, building a case for why she's wrong for this family. And what you actually proved, the whole time, is that you don't understand the first thing about why I married her. He looked at his mother. You think I needed someone from our world, someone who understood the expectations. Someone who would fit. He paused. I needed someone who would tell me the truth, who would look at something I'd stored wrong and tell me I'd stored it wrong instead of letting me wreck it to protect my ego. I needed someone who would say no to me. His jaw tightened. Do you understand how few people in my life have ever just said no to me? And meant it? Lenore's mouth moved. Nothing came out. She said no to me twice before she agreed to have dinner with me, Roman said. I knew then. That's what you've spent 3 years trying to get rid of. That's what you called the wrong association. Something moved across his face. Not anger, something more complicated than anger, something that had loss in it. I thought you knew me better. The silence that followed that sentence was different from all the other silences in the room. It had a different texture. Claudia had turned away slightly, her hand at her mouth. Lenora was looking at Roman with an expression that Naomi had never seen on her face before and could not immediately name, something stripped back from its usual surfaces. Then Lenora said very quietly, "I was afraid of losing you." Roman looked at her. "To her world, to whatever she would pull you toward. I was afraid of—" She stopped, started again. "When your father died, you were the thing that held everything together. You have always been the center of this family, and I have spent 30 years watching every other person in your life try to use that, try to get close enough to take from it." She didn't look at Naomi when she said it. She kept her eyes on her son. "I didn't want to lose you to someone I didn't choose." "Someone you didn't choose," Roman repeated. "Roman, I'm not yours to lose," he said. Not cruelly, with a clarity that was perhaps more painful than cruelty would have been. "I haven't been that since I was 19 years old, and you know it. The family that you built your whole identity around protecting, I built it, with my hands and my decisions and 30 years of choices you didn't always agree with. And every time you came around, because that's what we do. We come around." He looked at her steadily. "But what you've done here is different. You didn't just disagree with my choice. You worked against it. You worked against her. You treated my wife like she was something I'd tracked in from outside and needed to be cleaned away." His voice, still quiet, had acquired something harder. "And she let you. For 3 years she let you because she loved me enough not to put me in the position of choosing. That is the woman you called the wrong association." Lenora closed her eyes, briefly, then opened them. "I don't know what you want me to say," she said. "Right now, nothing." Roman turned toward the door. Then he stopped, turned back. "Actually, one thing." He looked at his mother. "You're going to come with me into that ballroom, because there are people in there who have heard 3 years of whatever you've been saying about my wife. And that ends tonight. Not tomorrow. Not after a conversation. Tonight." Claudia's head came up. "Roman, a public—" "Claudia." His voice cut clean across hers. "You've had 3 years of being careful. I'm done being careful." He looked at Naomi. She looked back at him. Something passed between them. An entire conversation conducted in the span of 2 seconds, in the particular language of two people who have lived close enough together long enough to have developed their own shorthand. She read in his face, "I've got you. I should have had you sooner. I'm sorry." She tried to send back something that was not quite forgiveness, because forgiveness wasn't what this moment required. Something more immediate than that. Something that said, "I'm here. I'm still here." He held out his hand. She took it. The ballroom was loud with the particular sound of a formal dinner in its 3rd hour. Silverware, laughter, the undercurrent of a dozen conversations weaving through each other. The hired string quartet had moved into something quieter, something that sat under the noise rather than competing with it. The chandeliers were at full, and the room was warm in the smell of the food and the flowers, and 60 people who had dressed carefully for this evening all combined into the specific atmosphere of the Vane family at its most presentational. Nobody expected Roman to walk back in the way he walked back in. He came through the main doors from the hallway side, not the side entrance he usually used, and he came in with Naomi's hand in his and Lenora and Claudia behind him, and the way he walked, the pace of it, the set of his shoulders, the absolute directedness of his movement toward the center of the room, caused a cascade of subtle reactions that spread from the door outward like a stone dropped in water. Heads turned, conversations stuttered. The string quartet didn't stop playing, but the first violinist missed a note. Jeffrey Marsh saw Roman first. He was at the main table, mid-sentence with the man to his left, and he stopped speaking in a way that made the man to his left turn to see what he was looking at. Roman stopped in the center of the room. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't raise his hand. He simply stopped walking, and the room, by some combination of instinct and the particular authority his presence carried, went quiet. Not all at once. In a wave. The table nearest him first, then the next, then the outer tables, until the string quartet was playing into absolute silence, and the first violinist finally lowered her bow. Roman looked around the room. He took his time doing it. 60 people. Business associates, cousins, family friends, the peripheral figures who had orbited the Vane name long enough to feel they were part of it. He looked at each section of the room the way you look at something you are committing to memory. Then he spoke. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," he said. His voice carried without effort in the quiet room. The anniversary dinner has been a tradition in this family for a long time. My father started it. He believed that the people in a man's life should see each other regularly, should know each other. He thought it kept people honest. He paused. I've thought about that a lot tonight. Nobody moved. 3 years ago, I brought my wife into this family. He didn't look at Naomi when he said it. He looked at the room. Some of you were at the wedding. Some of you have been at these dinners every year since. You've sat across from her and had conversations with her and eaten at the same table. He let the room sit with that for a moment. And some of you have also, over those 3 years, heard things about her, about the marriage, about whether she belongs here. He tilted his head very slightly. I know this because people talk, and because information eventually finds its way back to the person it concerns, and because I have not survived the things I've survived by being the last person in a room to understand what's actually being said. Jeffrey Marsh had not moved in 30 seconds. Several other people at the main table had developed the particular stillness of individuals who are not certain whether they are about to be named. I'm not going to stand here and list names, Roman said. That's not what this is. What this is... He stopped, took a breath. Something shifted in his expression for just a moment, something that was not anger and not grief, but some precise combination of both. What this is a correction. Because something has been allowed to exist in this family that I did not know about and would not have permitted if I had. And now I know about it, and it's done. Lenora was standing at the edge of the room near the door. She had not moved toward the tables. Claudia was beside her. Both of them were very still. My wife, Roman said, has spent 3 years in this family absorbing things that none of you should have said, and none of you should have allowed to be said in your presence, and none of you certainly should have repeated. She absorbed them because she was trying to protect me, because she understood that what I would do, if I knew, would have consequences. He paused. She was right about that. He turned then, looked at the main table. At Jeffrey Marsh specifically. Jeffrey Marsh had the look of a man who has just understood something with extreme unpleasant clarity. Jeffrey, Roman said, not loudly. The Alderton project oversight transfers to Hendricks as of Monday. We'll talk about the rest of the restructuring this week. Jeffrey opened his mouth, closed it, nodded. Roman looked at the room again. Certain family members who have held positions in my companies or who have been benefiting from properties I own will be contacted this week with adjusted arrangements. He kept his voice level, informational, as though he were discussing logistics. These adjustments are not punitive. They are clarifying. They reflect an updated understanding of what those relationships actually are. He glanced toward the door, toward Lenora, and then looked away. Anyone who has genuinely considered my wife a member of this family will notice very little change. Anyone who hasn't... He stopped. Let that sentence end where it ended. He turned to Naomi. She was standing beside him, her hand still in his, and she had been watching the room during his speech the way she'd watched the room for 3 years, carefully, attentively, reading the faces. She had watched Jeffrey Marsh go through 4 distinct expressions in 90 seconds. She had watched certain cousins exchange glances that contained entire calculations about their financial situations. She had watched 2 women at the far table whisper to each other and then stop whispering when they realized she was looking. Roman looked at her, just at her. The room full of people ceased to be the primary thing for a moment. I should have seen it, he said, quietly. Still public. He wasn't hiding it. I should have been paying the kind of attention here that I pay everywhere else. That's on me. His hand tightened around hers. That doesn't happen again. Naomi looked at him. She felt the room around her and the weight of 60 people watching, and she felt 3 years of accumulated weight. All those dinners, all those staircases, all those bathroom mirrors, all those mornings she'd said, I'm just tired. And she kept her face steady because she was Naomi, and she had been keeping her face steady for a long time, and she said very quietly, so that only he could hear, I know. 2 words. Carrying everything. Roman nodded, once. Then he raised his voice again back to the room. Dinner will continue. I'd ask everyone to enjoy the rest of the evening. He looked at the string quartet. The first violinist, who had been watching all of this with the wide, careful eyes of someone being paid to be invisible, raised her bow. Music resumed. The room exhaled. And then the specific buzzing chaos of 60 people recalibrating simultaneously. The whispers, The shifted chairs, the careful glances, the pointed looking away, filled the space where the silence had been. Roman began to move them toward the head of the main table. Naomi walked with him. She felt the eyes. She had always felt the eyes in this room. Tonight they felt different. Not warmer, not exactly, but altered, reconfigured. Some of them carrying something they hadn't carried before, which might have been respect, or might have been recalculation, and might have been both. And she was clear-eyed enough about human nature not to confuse those things. They reached the head of the table. Roman held the chair for her. She sat. For a moment the seat felt unfamiliar, which was ridiculous. She'd sat here before many times. But the room was different now in some fundamental way that she hadn't finished understanding yet. And so the familiar thing felt briefly strange, the way a room looks different after you've rearranged it, and you keep reaching for things that aren't where you left them. She reached for her water glass, took a sip, set it down. Across the room, near the door, Lenora had finally moved. She had taken a seat at one of the outer tables, not the main table, which Naomi noted without letting her face show that she'd noted it. Claudia sat beside her. They were not speaking to each other. Jeffrey Marsh cleared his throat and said something to the man on his left, and the conversation at the main table resumed, careful at first and then, with gradually increasing normalcy, the way water finds its level. Roman ordered more wine. He talked to the associate on his right about something Naomi didn't fully track. He was performing normalcy with the same skill he brought to everything, giving the room permission to settle by behaving as though it already had. Naomi sat beside him and performed her own version of the same thing, and somewhere underneath the performance she was processing what had just happened, trying to find the edges of it, trying to understand what it meant for the shape of everything that came next. Because here was what 3 years of watching and learning and managing had taught her. A public declaration from Roman Vane was not an ending. It was a detonation. And detonations did not resolve situations. They transformed them into rubble that then had to be sorted through, piece by piece, for a long time afterward. Lenora was still in the room. Claudia was still in the room. The cousins who had spent 3 years smiling at her in Roman's presence and saying unkind things in his absence were still in the room, recalculating their positions, trying to determine how to reorient themselves in the new landscape without losing more than they had to. And Naomi herself was sitting at the head of this table with Roman's name and Roman's hand and Roman's public defense wrapped around her like armor, and she was grateful for it, genuinely, deeply, without complication grateful. And she also knew, with the quiet certainty of a woman who had spent 3 years learning that love and protection are not the same thing, that armor provided by someone else can be removed by someone else, and that the only permanent protection was the kind that grew from inside. She hadn't finished becoming that woman yet. She was working on it. The dinner ended at 11. People left in clusters, some quickly, some with the lingering quality of guests who were hoping to gather information from the atmosphere of the room on their way out. Naomi stood with Roman near the main entrance and said goodnight to each person and watched their faces and read them with the precision she'd developed over years of archival work, where the ability to correctly identify and categorize a thing was the whole of the job. Several people who had never spoken to her with much warmth found warmth tonight. She stored that information without assigning it too much weight. Jeffrey Marsh shook her hand on his way out. "Mrs. Vane," he said. No elaboration. She nodded. He left. The cousins, Beatrice specifically, came to her near the end. Beatrice was a small woman in her late 50s with nervous hands and a social manner that had always struck Naomi as the manner of someone performing a more confident version of herself. She stopped in front of Naomi and looked at her and then looked at the floor briefly and then looked back up. "I owe you an apology," Beatrice said. Her voice was low. "Not for tonight. For other things. I participated in things I shouldn't have." She stopped. "I don't expect you to. I just needed to say it." Naomi looked at her for a moment, then said, "I hear you. Not thank you, not it's fine, not we'll move on. I hear you." Beatrice nodded. She left. The room had nearly emptied when Naomi realized that Lenora was still there. She was sitting alone at the outer table where she'd spent the latter half of the evening. Claudia had left. Naomi had seen her go 20 minutes ago, touching her mother's shoulder briefly, and then walking out with her husband with the purposeful speed of someone who needed air. Lenora sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her and looked at nothing in particular. The catering staff was beginning to quietly clear the far end of the ballroom. The string quartet had packed up and gone. The chandeliers had been dimmed by some attentive staff member from full brightness to something lower and warmer. Roman was in the hallway talking to one of his security team. His voice was low and professional, the particular register he used when he was giving instructions that he expected to be followed exactly. Naomi stood in the doorway of the ballroom and looked at Lenora. Lenora did not look back. She was either unaware that Naomi was watching her or was choosing not to acknowledge it. Naomi suspected the latter. Lenora Vane was not a woman who was unaware of things in her environment. Naomi walked toward the table. She pulled out a chair across from Lenora and sat down. Lenora looked up then. Her face was exhausted in a way that was entirely unfamiliar. The architecture of her composure still present, but visibly costing something to maintain. Her eyes, which usually communicated carefully controlled signals, were tired in a way that made her look, briefly, like an old woman. Naomi had not expected to feel anything about that. She was surprised to find that she felt something. "You don't have to sit with me," Lenora said. "I know," Naomi said. Silence. Lenora looked at her folded hands. "Roman will follow through," Naomi said. "You know that." "I know," Lenora said. "The foundation, the properties, the business positions." Naomi said it not as a threat. She was careful with her tone, but as information, fact stating. "He means what he says." Lenora said nothing. A muscle in her jaw moved. "I'm not going to tell you it's fair," Naomi continued. "I'm not going to sit here and tell you that what happens next is okay. Some of it is probably going to hurt people who deserved less than what they're going to get because of this. That's how consequences work when they come all at once instead of being dealt with as they happen." She paused. "That's partly on me. I let things build when I should have spoken earlier." Lenora looked up at that. Something in her expression shifted. "I'm not saying that so you'll think better of me," Naomi said. "I'm saying it because it's true. I made choices about what to absorb and what to protect, and those choices had their own consequences." She looked at Lenora steadily. "The difference between your choices and mine is that mine were about protecting something. I'm still not completely certain what yours were about." Lenora was quiet for a long moment. The catering staff moved at the far end of the room like ghosts, careful and quiet. "I've been afraid for a long time," Lenora finally said. Her voice was different from any version of it Naomi had heard before. Smaller, without the precision that usually characterized it. Not of you specifically, of change, of things being taken from me, of Roman building a life I wasn't part of. She stopped. His father was the center of this family. When he died, Roman became the center, and I have spent 12 years making sure I was close enough to the center that I couldn't be removed. She said the word as though it tasted like something. "What I felt when he married you in 3 months without—" She shook her head. "It wasn't reason. I know that. But fear doesn't feel like fear when you're inside it. It feels like sense." Naomi looked at her. She thought about 3 years. She thought about the kitchen and the seating chart and the word companion and Jeffrey Marsh and the ballroom and all of it, the whole accumulated weight of it. She thought about her mother's pearls. "I believe that," she said. "I believe that's what it felt like to you." Lenora looked at her, something in her eyes that was close to surprise. "That doesn't mean it was right," Naomi added. "Fear explains. It doesn't justify." She looked at the table between them. "Roman is going to do what he's going to do. And I'm not going to ask him not to, because what you did wasn't only to me. It was to him, too. You went around him. You treated his marriage like something you had authority over. That's between you and your son, and it's going to take a long time." She looked up. "But what's between you and me? That's separate. And I'm telling you tonight that I haven't decided yet what to do with it. I haven't decided to close the door. I haven't decided to forgive. I haven't decided anything except that I'm done being afraid to say out loud what I think." She held Lenora's gaze. "That's the woman your son married. I'm sorry it took me 3 years to let you see her." Lenora looked at Naomi for a long time without speaking. Then Roman appeared in the doorway. He looked at the two of them across the empty ballroom, his wife and his mother sitting across from each other at a table littered with the aftermath of the evening. And his expression did something complicated that Naomi couldn't fully read from that distance. He walked toward them, stopped at the end of the table. "Mom," he said. Lenora stood. She did it slowly, the way people stand when they're tired all the way through. She looked at her son, and she looked, for the first time in Naomi's memory, uncertain of what he would give back to her. "I need time," Roman said. "That's all I can tell you right now. I need time." Lenora nodded. She reached out and touched his arm, briefly, 2 fingers against his sleeve, the most tentative gesture Naomi had ever seen from her. And then she took her coat from the back of her chair, and she walked across the empty ballroom toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped. She didn't turn around. "She loves you correctly," Lenora said. Her voice was quiet enough that it almost didn't carry. "I could see it. I could see it, and I was afraid of it, and I—" She stopped. "I know that means very little right now." She went through the door. The sound of the estate settling into its nighttime quiet filled the ballroom. Somewhere outside, a car started. Roman sat down in the chair his mother had just vacated. He sat across from Naomi in the dimmed ballroom and looked at her across the surface of the table and said nothing for a long moment. "What did you say to her?" he asked. "The truth," Naomi said. "The same thing I should have said a long time ago to everyone." He looked at her. The exhaustion on his face was real. Different from his post-trip exhaustion, deeper, the exhaustion of a man who has spent an evening dismantling things he built over a long time and is now sitting in the space where they were. "Are you okay?" he asked. She thought about the question, really thought about it. "I will be," she said. He reached across the table. His hand covered hers on the white tablecloth. "I'm sorry I wasn't paying attention," he said. "I know," she said. "That's not—" He stopped. Tried again. "I need you to know that I understand it's not enough to just say that. Saying it doesn't fix 3 years." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." He looked at her and she looked at him, and they were 2 people sitting across a formal dinner table at midnight in a room that still smelled of flowers and wine and the event that had just irrevocably changed the shape of something. "What do we do now?" he asked. Naomi looked at her husband, at the sharp dark planes of his face in the low light, at the particular quality of his attention directed entirely at her, the same attention that had once been trained on a badly stored Basquiat in a private collection, the same attention that had, when she'd told him he was doing something wrong, immediately shifted to fixing it. That was who he was. That had always been who he was. She just needed him to apply it to the right things. "Now," she said, "we go home." "We are home," he said. "No," Naomi said. She stood. She held out her hand. "Now we go home." He looked at her hand, then he took it. He stood, and they walked out of the ballroom together, through the house that was theirs, through the rooms that had held 3 years of things unsaid, toward whatever came next, which was not going to be easy, and was not going to be clean, and was going to require a long, sustained effort from both of them that no single evening of reckoning could substitute for. But they were walking toward it, together. And that, for the first time in a long time, felt like enough to begin with, which was the most dangerous kind of feeling, the kind that made you believe the hardest part was already behind you, when in truth the hardest part was always the part that came after the dramatic moment, the part nobody dramatized because it looked like ordinary life from the outside. 2 people waking up the next morning and the morning after that, and choosing, in all the small, unremarkable ways that choices are made, to keep building something worth. The morning after the anniversary dinner, Naomi woke up before Roman. This was not unusual. She had always been an early riser, a habit from childhood, from years of being the first one up in a Baltimore row house where the mornings belonged to whoever claimed them first. She lay still for a moment in the gray pre-dawn quiet of their bedroom and listened to Roman's breathing beside her and looked at the ceiling and tried to take stock of what she felt. What she felt was not what she expected. She expected relief. Some version of it, anyway. The loosening that should come after a long-held thing is finally released. Instead, what she felt was something more complicated and less comfortable, a kind of raw alertness, like skin after a bandage has been removed. The wound underneath was real, and it was hers, and now that it was exposed to air, she was going to have to figure out what to do with it. She got up carefully, found her robe on the chair by the window, went downstairs. The ballroom had been cleaned by the staff overnight. Every trace of the evening removed, tables back to their usual configuration, chandeliers raised, the smell of flowers replaced by the neutral smell of cleaned surfaces. She stood in the doorway and looked at it, and it looked exactly as it always had, which struck her as faintly absurd. Something that significant had happened in this room last night, and the room gave no evidence of it. Rooms never did. That was the things about spaces. They held nothing. The events moved on and the rooms remained, indifferent. She went to the kitchen and made coffee. Maria arrived at 6:30 to find Naomi sitting at the kitchen island with both hands around a mug, looking at nothing in particular. Maria stopped in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Maria said quietly, "Good morning, Mrs. Vane." "Good morning," Naomi said. Maria went to the counter and began her own preparations, and Naomi watched her and thought about all the mornings over 3 years when Maria had navigated the specific social geography of this house with that careful, practiced invisibility. Knowing things, seeing things, choosing, every day, what to carry and what to set down. "Maria," Naomi said. The woman turned. "I want to apologize to you," Naomi said. Maria's expression shifted into something careful. "Mrs. Vane, you've been in the middle of something for 3 years that you never should have been in the middle of," Naomi said. "You were put in impossible positions, and you handled them with more grace than I recognized at the time. I want you to know I recognized it. Even then, I just didn't say so." Maria looked at her for a moment. Her eyes were dark and steady, and they held something, some accumulated weight of observation that she had never been invited to put down before. "Thank you," Maria said, simply, without elaboration. Naomi nodded. She returned to her coffee. They existed in the kitchen together in the early morning quiet, and it was perhaps the most honest shared silence Naomi had experienced in this house, which told her something about the last 3 years that she was going to have to sit with for a while. Roman came down at 7:30. He looked like he hadn't slept much. Not the dishevelment of poor sleep, but the particular focused alertness of a man who had been awake thinking through logistics. He accepted coffee from Maria with a nod and came to sit beside Naomi at the island, and for a few minutes they were just two people in a kitchen in the morning, which was ordinary, which was what she needed it to be for a moment before anything else. "Jeffrey called," Roman said, "at 6. "What did he say?" "He apologized." Roman said it without inflection. "He said he should have come to me directly when my mother approached him. He said he made a calculation about his position and chose wrong." "What did you say?" "I said I appreciated the honesty and that I'd factor it into the restructuring." He took a sip of coffee. "He'll keep his position, reduce scope. If he stays clean for 18 months, we revisit." Naomi looked at her mug. "That's fair." "It's practical," Roman said. "Jeffrey is good at what he does. What he did was a judgment error made under social pressure from someone with influence over his access. I've made allowances for worse from people who were less useful." She heard the difference between what he was saying and what he wasn't saying, which was that the mercy extended to Jeffrey was not being extended universally, and that the distinction between who received which treatment had its own specific logic. "Your mother," she said. Roman set his mug down. "Yeah." "What happens with the foundation?" "I've already spoken to the board. My mother's involvement will be reduced to advisory. She loses operational control effective at the end of the month." He said it the way he said most things of consequence, without ceremony, as though the decision having been made discussion of it beside the point. "She built a lot of the foundation's early programming. I'm not taking away her ability to contribute. I'm taking away her ability to run it as her personal operation. She's going to see that as punishment." "It is punishment," Roman said. "I'm not pretending it isn't, but it's also accurate. She's been using foundation resources to maintain social relationships that she leveraged against my marriage. That's a misuse of a charitable infrastructure. I'm correcting a structural problem." He looked at Naomi. "The fact that it also hurts her is not incidental, but it's not the primary purpose." Naomi nodded slowly. "My cousin Preston loses the property on Meridian," Roman continued. "He's been living there for 7 years at my expense. We're done." He paused. "Beatrice's situation is different. She came to you last night. That carries weight with me." "She did," Naomi confirmed. "I don't know how much it meant. I don't know yet what I make of it." "You don't have to know yet," Roman said. "You don't have to know any of it yet." She looked at him. He was looking at the counter, at his coffee, and his profile in the morning light had the quality of something she had looked at 1,000 times, and was only now seeing certain aspects of clearly. The line of his jaw, the way his hand rested on the countertop, not tense, not fully relaxed. The permanent low-grade vigilance of a man who had learned very young that the world required watching. "What about Claudia?" she asked. Roman was quiet for a moment. "Claudia is more complicated," he said. "She is. She didn't initiate, she participated. There's a difference in degree." He picked up his mug and set it down again without drinking. "She also has 2 children who are not responsible for what she did. My restructuring of her access affects them." "I'm not asking you to punish the children," Naomi said. "I know." He looked at her. "I'm telling you how I'm thinking about it, because you deserve to know how I'm thinking about all of it." He held her gaze. "I spent 3 years not knowing what was happening in my own house, and I am not going to fix that by reverting to making unilateral decisions and presenting you with the outcome." Something in her chest shifted. It was not a dramatic shift. Nothing so clean as that. More like the very slow release of a pressure that had been building so gradually she'd stopped registering it as pressure and had started assuming it was just the weight of things. "Roman," she said. "Yeah. I need to talk to Claudia myself." He was still. "Not because it's my responsibility to fix it," she said carefully. "And not because I'm going to let her off the hook, but because what happened between her and me is something different from what happened between her and you, and I need to handle my part of it myself." Roman looked at her for a long moment, then, "When?" "When I'm ready, not today." He nodded. The days that followed had the strange dual quality of aftermath. On one level ordinary, the unremarkable rhythm of waking and eating and working, and the small transactions of shared domestic life. On another level, charged with the particular energy of things that had been said in public that could not be unsaid. The invisible rearrangement of a social world adjusting to new information. Roman's phone ran constantly for the first 3 days. He took the calls with his usual contained efficiency, and Naomi heard fragments, tone more than content, that told her the ripples of the anniversary dinner were moving through his networks in ways that were still resolving. She didn't ask for details. She knew he would tell her what was relevant when it was relevant. They were building, somewhat awkwardly, the practice of a new kind of communication between them, one that required effort from both sides because the patterns of the previous 3 years had made certain things easier to not say than to say. And those patterns didn't dissolve in a night regardless of what the night had contained. On the 4th day after the dinner, Naomi drove herself to Baltimore. She hadn't told Roman she was going. She'd left a note, "Gone to see Mom back tonight," because she was a grown woman and she didn't require permission to visit her mother, and also because there were things she needed to say to her mother that she didn't want filtered through anyone else's knowledge of them. Her mother's house smelled exactly as it always had. She didn't know how to describe that smell to anyone who hadn't grown up in it. Something layered, years deep, the specific accumulated scent of a life lived in one place by one person over a long time. Her mother was in the kitchen when she arrived, reading, glasses on, the newspaper spread on the table in front of her the way it was every morning, because her mother had read a physical newspaper every morning for 50 years and had no intention of changing. She looked up when Naomi walked in. She looked at her daughter's face for a moment, the way mothers look, the rapid comprehensive scan that takes in everything and processes it somewhere deep before the expression settles into something displayable. "Sit down," her mother said. Naomi sat. Her mother got up and poured coffee she hadn't been asked for and set it in front of Naomi and sat back down and picked up her newspaper and didn't say anything else for about 3 minutes, which was its own kind of communication. Then she set the paper down. "Tell me," she said. Naomi told her. Not everything. It would have taken too long, and her mother was practical about how she spent time, but the shape of it. 3 years compressed into 20 minutes. What had been done, and what Naomi had absorbed and why she'd absorbed it, and what had happened at the dinner and what had come after. She told it flatly, without the emotional overlay she'd been carrying, and as she told it, she realized this was the first time she had told it to someone she didn't have to manage in the telling. Someone whose reaction she didn't have to calibrate for, protect from, or shape around. Her mother listened without interrupting. This was a skill Naomi had always admired in her, the ability to receive information completely before responding to it. Too many people began formulating their response while still in the middle of hearing something. Her mother was not one of those people. When Naomi finished, there was a silence. Keep something of yourself, her mother said. Naomi looked at her. That's what I told you, her mother said. On your wedding morning, keep something of yourself. She folded her hands on the table. Did you? Naomi thought about it, really thought about it. The 3 years of managed silences and the work she'd protected and the mornings in the kitchen and the careful interior geography she'd built within that enormous house. All the ways she'd tried to maintain some boundary between who she was and what the environment around her was trying to make her. I think so, she said. Barely, but yes. Her mother nodded. Then you did the main thing. She reached for her coffee. The rest is cleaning up. It's more than cleaning up, Naomi said. I know, her mother said. But you're here talking to me, clear-eyed, not broken. That means something. She looked at her daughter over the rim of her mug. What does Roman say about why he didn't see it? He says he should have been paying attention. Does he understand why he wasn't? Naomi paused. I don't know if he's gotten there yet. That's the work, her mother said. The rest of it, the consequences, the restructuring, the public moment. That's all necessary, and I'm glad it happened, but that's the corrective action on the outside. The actual work is the inside part. Why did a man who pays attention to everything miss this specific thing for 3 years? Naomi looked at the table. Because it was his family, she said. Because some part of him needed to believe it wasn't happening. Yes, her mother said. And he's going to have to sit with what that cost you. That's not a comfortable thing to sit with. He's going to want to fix it with action because he's a man who fixes things with action. You're going to have to let him feel it before he fixes it. I know, Naomi said. Do you know? Her mother said. Not unkindly. With the particular directness of a woman who had known her daughter for 37 years and understood that knowing something in the abstract and knowing it in the body were two different things. Naomi looked at her mother, felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel clearly in a long time. Something straightforward and old and grounding, the specific comfort of being known by someone who was entirely on your side without that allegiance requiring you to perform anything. I'm working on it, she said. Her mother reached across the table and covered Naomi's hand with hers. Her palm was warm and dry and exactly as familiar as it had been when Naomi was 7 years old. Good, her mother said. They drank their coffee. The morning light came through the kitchen window the way it always had, at the same angle, hitting the same corner of the same wall. Naomi had looked at this wall through that light her entire life, and had never once, as a child, imagined that somewhere across a city there was an estate with a ballroom and 11 bedrooms where she would one day have to fight, quietly, and for years, for the right to be considered real. She was glad she had fought. She was still working out what she thought about how she'd fought and what she'd let happen while the fight was going on. She suspected she'd be working that out for a while, but she was glad. She spoke to Claudia 3 weeks later. Not at the estate, not on the phone. Claudia had called twice in the intervening weeks and Naomi had not answered, and she felt no obligation to justify that to anyone. When she was ready, she chose a restaurant, neutral ground, a place neither of them had associations with. And she sent a text that said simply, Tuesday, noon. She included the address. Claudia was already there when Naomi arrived. She was sitting at the table with her hands around a water glass, and she looked as though she had not been sleeping particularly well, which was, Naomi noted without satisfaction, probably accurate. Naomi sat down. A waiter appeared and Naomi ordered coffee and asked for a moment, and the waiter disappeared. For a full 30 seconds, neither woman spoke. Naomi let the silence run. She had learned over 3 years in the Vane family's orbit that silence was not neutral. It had shape and pressure, and you could use it if you understood how. She had learned that primarily from Lenora. It was perhaps the most useful thing Lenora had ever taught her. I don't know how to start, Claudia said. Then I will, Naomi said. I'm not here to forgive you. I want you to understand that going in. This isn't that kind of conversation. Claudia's jaw tightened. She nodded. I'm here because you're Roman's sister, and that means you're going to be in my life for the rest of our lives, unless one of us does something that makes that impossible. And I want to know whether what's happened is recoverable or not. That's the purpose of this conversation. Not to make peace, not to reset, to assess. She held Claudia's gaze. Can you be honest with me? Actually honest? I can try, Claudia said. That's not enough, Naomi said. I need a yes or a no. Claudia looked at her. Something in her expression, the default social warmth that she deployed so automatically, was absent, and what was underneath it was less polished but considerably more real. She looked, without her usual surface management, like someone who was tired and ashamed and not entirely sure what to do with either feeling. "Yes," Claudia said. "Why did you do it?" Naomi asked. Not the social pressure explanation, not the family loyalty explanation, the real one. Claudia was quiet. She turned her water glass a quarter rotation and turned it back. "Because it was easy," she said finally. Naomi had expected a more elaborate answer. The simplicity of that one landed differently. "Easy," she said. "Mom started it. She set the tone. And I went along because it was easier than pushing back. Because pushing back against my mother cost something, and going along cost nothing, or it seemed like it didn't cost anything." She stopped. "I told myself I was neutral, that I wasn't participating. I was just not intervening, but not intervening was participation. I know that." She looked up. "I've known that for a while." "How long?" Naomi asked. "The second year," Claudia said quietly. "The charity event where she introduced you as a companion. I watched your face. You didn't react. You kept that composure you have, that thing where nothing shows." She shook her head. "And I watched you not react, and I thought, she knows exactly what just happened, and she is choosing not to make a scene, which means she has been choosing this over and over, which means it has been happening over and over, and I am watching it happen right now and doing nothing." Her voice was flat, self-indicting, without the performance of remorse that Naomi had expected and didn't trust. "I did nothing. And then the next thing happened, and I did nothing again. And it became the arrangement, the way things were." Naomi looked at her. "You also contributed to it. It wasn't only your mother." "I know. The things you said about my work, my background, the calls you made while Roman was away." "I know," "No," Claudia said again. Her voice was lower. "I told myself those were smaller, less serious. I was rationalizing." "Yes," Naomi said simply. "You were." The waiter came back with coffee. Naomi wrapped her hands around the mug. Claudia hadn't touched her water. "What do you want from me?" Claudia asked. "Concretely, what would actually make a difference?" It was the right question, Naomi thought. Not what she could offer. She'd probably been preparing offers, apologies in various configurations, things she thought Naomi might want to hear. Instead, she was asking what would actually matter, which required her to set aside what was comfortable for her to give and actually think about what was useful. "Nothing right now," Naomi said. "Nothing today and nothing this month." She watched Claudia process that. You can't buy back trust with actions in the short term. The only thing that buys back trust is time and consistency, and there's no way to accelerate it. She took a sip of coffee. "What I want from you concretely, over time, is this. When your mother says something about me or Roman's marriage or my position in this family that is wrong, you tell her it's wrong. Out loud. In the room. Not later, not privately, not in a way that gives you plausible deniability. In the room." Claudia was very still. "That's what you didn't do," Naomi said. "That's the thing that over 3 years might have changed the shape of everything. Not you being my advocate, not you loving me or even liking me, just standing in the room and saying, 'That's not right. That's all I'm asking for going forward.'" "I can do that," Claudia said. "I hope so," Naomi said. "I'm not taking it on faith. I'm telling you what I'm looking for, and we'll see." Claudia nodded. She looked, at that moment, genuinely younger than her age. Something in the stripped-back quality of her face, without its usual social management, that made her look like someone who was just beginning to understand the full weight of certain things. "Roman is very angry with me," she said. It came out smaller than her other statements, closer to something she was actually afraid of. "Yes," Naomi said. "Do you think he'll... How long does he..." She stopped, started again. "He's my brother. He's always been my brother first and the rest of it second, and I'm afraid I've done something to that." Naomi looked at her. She felt the complicated truth of the moment, that she could, if she wanted to, say something reassuring here, that Roman loves his sister, that damage is repairable, that time and effort restore things. Some of those things were probably true. And she also felt, with equal clarity, that it was not her job to carry Claudia's fear about her relationship with Roman, that fear was Claudia's to carry and Claudia's to earn her way out of. "That's between you and Roman," Naomi said. "I can't speak to it and I wouldn't try." It was the truest answer. It was also not the comforting one. Claudia absorbed it. They finished the meeting without resolution, which was, Naomi had decided beforehand, exactly what she wanted. Not closure, not a bow on it. A beginning of something that would need to be built slowly over time with consistent material, and might fail, and might not. And the outcome was not something she was prepared to predetermine. She drove home alone. She felt the texture of the afternoon, the weight of having said what she meant, the slight exhaustion of it, the absence of the relief she'd expected. True conversations about true things were not relieving, she'd learned. They were clarifying, which was different. They left you not lighter, but cleaner. Still carrying the weight, but knowing more clearly what the weight was made of. The conversation with Lenora took 4 more months. It did not happen by arrangement. It happened on a November afternoon when Naomi arrived at the estate after a day in the city to find Lenora sitting in the side garden, which was unusual. Lenora rarely came to the estate unannounced anymore, and the garden in November was cold and past its peak, the plants cut back for winter, the fountain turned off, the space having the particular austere beauty of things in preparation for dormancy. Naomi almost went inside. Instead, she went to the garden. Lenora was sitting on the stone bench nearest the old oak tree, the one Roman had told her his father had planted when Roman was born, which made it 41 years old, which meant it was not as old as it looked, though Naomi supposed 41 years of growing in one place would make anything seem older than its calendar age. Naomi sat on the other end of the bench. The garden was quiet. The city was distant enough that its noise was only a texture rather than a specific sound. A bird was doing something persistent in the oak tree above them. Lenora did not look up when Naomi sat down. She was looking at her hands in her lap. She had aged visibly in the past 4 months. Not dramatically, but in the specific way that stress and loss of position age people who have built their identity on maintaining both. A loosening of something that had been held very tight for a very long time. "I've been thinking about what you said," Lenora said. "In the ballroom that night, after everyone left." "What part?" Naomi asked. "That I wasn't protecting Roman. That I was protecting what I wanted his life to look like." She was quiet for a moment. The bird in the oak made its sound and went quiet and made it again. "I've been turning that over for months, and I keep arriving at the same place, which is that you were right, and that I've been right about enough things in my life that being wrong about something this large is difficult." Naomi said nothing. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," Lenora said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not sitting here to ask you for something. I'm sitting here because I owe you something, and I intend to give it whether or not it does either of us any good." She looked up then, at Naomi, directly, without the social armor, without the careful management of her expression. Her eyes were old in a way that Naomi had never seen them, and clear, and something in them that might have been, not quite grief, but its near relative. "I was wrong," Lenora said, "about you, about what you were to Roman and what you could give him. I was wrong in a way that caused you harm for years, in your own home, and I leveraged every advantage I had to make you feel like a visitor, in a place where you had every right to belong." She held Naomi's gaze. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not sure I'd forgive me, but I needed to say it to your face, without conditions, without asking for anything back." Naomi sat with it. The oak tree creaked slightly in the cold breeze. The fountain basin held a thin layer of dead leaves. "I hear you," Naomi said. Lenora nodded. "Once." "I'm not going to tell you it's okay," Naomi said. "It's not okay. It may never fully be okay in the way you want it to be. There are things that happened that left marks that don't disappear because the person who made them apologized." She looked at the garden. "But I'm also not going to spend my life maintaining anger toward you. It takes too much of me, and I need what it takes." She looked at Lenora. "So what I'm prepared to give you is this. We start from here. Not from before. There is no going back to before. We start from this bench, in this garden, in November, with everything that's been set on the table and no pretending that it hasn't. If you can work within that, so can I. If you can show up honestly instead of strategically, I can meet you there." She paused. "But the first time you manage me instead of talking to me, we're done. I mean that. Not as a threat. As information about who I am and what I will and won't live inside." Lenora was looking at her with an expression Naomi couldn't fully categorize, not the expression she'd worn for 3 years, that carefully calibrated social face. Something rawer than that, and less certain, and somehow more human. "You're a formidable woman," Lenora said quietly. And it did not sound like a compliment delivered for effect. It sounded like something she was understanding for the first time about a person she had spent 3 years refusing to fully see. "I know," Naomi said. She said it without apology and without performance, the way you say something that is simply true. Winter passed. Then spring. Roman and Naomi's marriage in the months that followed was not a transformed thing. It was not what people in stories mean when they say transformed, implying something clean and completed. It was a working thing, a thing under constant low-level construction. There were mornings when Roman tried to fix with action what needed to be felt, and Naomi had to say so, and it was uncomfortable, and he had to sit in that discomfort long enough to actually do something with it, rather than redirect it into logistics. There were evenings when Naomi caught herself starting to manage a conversation instead of having it, starting to calculate what to say versus what she actually meant, and had to stop herself and begin again in the more exposed territory of honesty. It was not always graceful. It was sometimes tiring in ways that the previous year's silence had not been tiring, because at least silence was familiar, and this ongoing choice to surface things instead of absorb them required a kind of daily effort that she hadn't fully anticipated. But the tiredness was different. It had a different quality. The exhaustion of building was not the same as the exhaustion of enduring, even when the symptoms looked similar from the outside. Roman began coming home when he said he would. Not every time. There were still calls, still crises, still the unpredictable demands of the life he'd built, but the pattern shifted. He made choices that communicated priority without making speeches about it. He sat with her through things that didn't resolve quickly. He stopped filling silence with solutions when what silence contained was something that needed to be heard. Naomi stopped going to the bathroom to collect herself after family events. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. The following autumn, 1 full year after the anniversary dinner, there was another Vane family dinner, smaller than the previous year. Several people who had attended last year were not invited this year, and nobody made a point of noting that. The guest list had been quietly restructured along lines that reflected, without announcement, the adjustments Roman had made to the family's landscape over the preceding 12 months. Lenora came. Claudia came with her husband and children, several cousins, several of Roman's long-standing business associates. Beatrice came. She and Naomi had had exactly 3 conversations in the past year, brief, careful, honest, in the specific limited way of 2 people who are not yet sure what they are to each other, but have agreed to find out. It was enough. It was a beginning. Naomi dressed alone in their bedroom. She chose an emerald green dress, not because anyone had told her to, not because it was strategic, but because she had seen it in a window 3 weeks ago and thought, that one. Because she liked the color and the way it fell, and because for the first time in what felt like a long time, she was choosing things for herself again. From the uncomplicated position of knowing what she liked, without the overlay of managing how the choice would be received. She put on her mother's pearl earrings. She stood in front of the mirror. She looked at herself for a moment. Not checking, not assessing for adequacy, just looking, the way you look at something you are simply present with. Roman appeared in the doorway behind her. He had his jacket on, his tie done, and he looked at her in the mirror with an expression that was private, not the public version of Roman Vane, not the contained, controlled face that ran the empire, but the face she had first seen across a dinner table in a private collection when she'd told him he'd stored his Basquiat wrong. The face that she had married. "Ready?" he said. She looked at herself one more time, at the woman in the mirror who had spent 3 years making herself smaller to preserve a piece that was never offered back to her, who had sat at the wrong table and answered to the wrong words, and absorbed things that left marks, who had loved her husband enough to protect him from something he would have wanted to know, and who was still working out whether that protection had been a form of love or a failure of it, or both simultaneously, which was the kind of question you could turn over for a long time without arriving at a clean answer, who had, in the end, stayed herself. Barely. But yes. "Ready," she said. She walked into the ballroom with Roman's hand in hers, and she didn't brace herself. That was the thing she noticed first. The absence of the bracing, The physical habit of 3 years, the slight tension she carried into any Vane family room, the preparation for impact, it wasn't there. Not fully gone, not dissolved into certainty, but quiet enough that she could feel, in its place, something else. The conversations that stopped briefly when she entered the room stopped. The way conversations always stop when someone worth looking at enters a space. Not with the particular charge of disapproval or the complicated calculus of people determining how to receive an intruder. Just the ordinary pause of people registering a presence. Lenora was at the far end of the room. She saw Naomi, and something in her expression moved, subtle, controlled, but real. She nodded. Naomi nodded back. Claudia was with her children near the bar, and she caught Naomi's eye and held it for a moment, and then looked away. And the look was not warm exactly. Warmth was something they were building slowly over months with the specific material of small, honest interactions. But it was not weaponized, and that was a thing worth noting. Roman greeted the room the way he always greeted rooms, with the gravity and ease of a man who understood the weight of being watched and had made peace with it. He talked to his associates, shook hands, moved through the space with his hand at the small of Naomi's back at first, and then letting her move independently as she chose, because he had learned in the preceding year to know that she didn't need to be accompanied through this room. She needed to know she could walk through it alone and that he would be there when she turned around. She talked to Beatrice for 15 minutes about a private collection in the Northeast that Beatrice had mentioned 3 months ago that Naomi was being asked to consult on. It was a real conversation about something she knew, about her actual work, which was not a little project, which was an expertise she'd spent her adult life building, which was hers. She talked to 2 of Roman's associates she'd never gotten to know properly because she'd spent too much energy managing other things to cultivate those connections. She found, in a brief conversation with one of them, a woman named Dara who ran logistics infrastructure for Roman's legitimate holdings, someone she thought she might, over time, genuinely like. She moved through the room. Toward the end of the evening, Roman found her by the bookcase on the south wall. Not the library, the bookcase in the main room that had been there since his grandfather, and he stood beside her with a glass of wine and looked at the room with her. "How are you doing?" he asked. His voice was low, for her only. She looked at the room, at the people in it, at the elaborate living system of a family and its extended world, with all its damage and its history and its ongoing complicated negotiating with itself. "I'm here," she said. He looked at her. "That's not an answer." "Yes, it is," she said. She looked at him. "A year ago it wasn't. Tonight it is." He understood her. That was the thing. He had always understood her, underneath everything, had always had the capacity for it. He had simply needed to apply it in the right direction, and she had simply needed to stop absorbing things in the dark and trust him with the weight. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, briefly, without theater. Then he looked back at the room, and she looked back at the room, and the room continued being what rooms are. Full of imperfect people navigating imperfect histories. None of it clean, none of it finished, all of it ongoing. She had spent 3 years trying to secure her place in this family by making herself acceptable to people who had decided before she arrived that they would not accept her. She had learned, slowly and at cost, that acceptability was the wrong currency. It could be withdrawn. It could be withheld. It was always, ultimately, in someone else's hands. What was in her own hands was simpler and less negotiable. She knew who she was. She was Naomi Vane, who had been Naomi Webb from Baltimore, who had been raised by a woman who kept pearl earrings in a velvet box and knew exactly what they were worth, who had spent her life learning to read the things that time preserved and the things that it destroyed, which was its own kind of understanding of permanence, who had loved a man fully enough to protect him from painful things and had learned that love was not the same as protection and that the difference mattered, who had endured a specific kind of sustained cruelty and had come out of it not unscathed but clear. She was still that woman. She was still herself. In the end, that was the thing Lenora had tried to take and hadn't managed to, not for lack of effort, simply because some things, if you're very careful and you have the right beginning and you keep returning to it even when you've drifted far from it, cannot be taken from the outside. They can only be surrendered. And Naomi had not surrendered. Roman was beside her. The room was warm. The evening was moving, as evenings do, toward its natural end. She stood at the edge of the room with her husband and her mother's pearls and the specific knowledge of a woman who has been through something and found herself still standing on the other side. Not triumphant, not unbruised, but standing. And she thought, this is enough. Not as resignation, as a statement of fact about sufficiency, about the thing in front of her which was real and present and imperfect in hers. This is enough.